My mom was very engaged in community and in women's rights. I remember at 6 years old, I was actually on the cover of the newspaper marching in a women's rights march with my friend Candace. We were both 6. It was really instilled in me by both my mom and my dad that as a girl, as a woman, there were no limitations to what I could expect from life, and that if I was willing to work hard, then I could achieve anything I wanted to achieve. That was really kind of drilled into me as a child, and working hard and focusing on goals was a big part of my childhood.
I grew up in the 1960s and 70s in Courtenay, and my parents were, I'd say, I don't really know how to summarize them, but typical for their time. My mother was a nurse, and my father he had various jobs after the military, but for most of my childhood, he was in real estate sales. So we were what I'd consider kind of a working class family. We owned our own home, and my parents' attitudes as parents were very common for the day. They weren't strict, but they were very different kinds of parents than is sort of the modern parent, as all their friends were as well. I think they gave me a good grounding in sort of values and ethics of a good life, of being tolerant. They were a mixed race couple. My mother is half Chinese, so they'd gone through their own difficulties as a mixed race couple, so they were very tolerant people, and I learned that kind of openness and tolerance from them. I'm very grateful for that, and I think I really learned a good work ethic, especially from my mother, who was quite fixated on everyone having good work ethics.
So growing up as a young woman in the church community, there were, of course, a lot of expectations about behaviors, about choices, about how I would live my life. And I think those expectations are common, especially in the church and especially for young women. And those expectations were, of course, partially internal. They were the morals that I was brought up with, but they were also definitely external in terms of good Christian girls don't party, good Christian girls don't do this, they don't do that. So I was raised very much, and like I said, a lot of it was internal, to be to live under the expectation of what other people thought was good and right. So that really shaped who I was as a person. And as I became an adult, as I went to university, met my first husband, got married, that shaped who I thought I needed to be in community and as a person.
I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, and my family, my dad was an immigrant from Germany. He came actually to Vancouver Island when he was a teenager, finished high school and started university here. And my mom grew up on Vancouver Island. Her mom was born on Saturna Island at the turn of the century, just around 1902, 1903. So big, deep roots on Vancouver Island, and then my parents met and ended up moving to Edmonton. I grew up there, but really felt like I belonged here and moved back here when I was 20.
When I think back to my teen years in Courtenay, so that was in the 1970s, and the 1970s here in Canada was and in BC especially, a time with a lot of drugs coming in, a lot of shifting thinking around everything. There was a lot of activism. There was more thoughts about strengthening women's roles. It was kind of an ending of a very long conservative period. And as a teenager, I was certainly happy to embrace sort of new standards of trying different being trying different drugs. I was one of those teenagers. I wouldn't call myself a bad kid because I never got into any criminal or violent, nothing like that. And I always kept my grades up. I was always an A student. But I was one of those teenagers that a lot of people don't necessarily want at that time because I was a bit wild, I suppose. I was just testing out new boundaries. My parents were both, I think my mother actually quietly really wanted me to have a lot of fun as a teenager because she remembered her own teenagehood as not that fun because she had to carry financial responsibilities for her very poor family. But so she was sort of torn between wanting to see me out there and yet not wanting me to be quite so up to all the things that I did get up to. And they tried to find a place of discipline. I mean, they used what was called grounding. So basically they'd tell me, that's it, you can't leave the house for 2 weeks because you've done this thing that we didn't want you to do. But my father always gave in, and I was very sneaky too. So there was a lot of the things, what I quickly learned was how to do the things I wanted to do without my parents knowing.
I switched schools in grade 3 from one elementary school to another. I started at Richard C. Gordon. I took a kind of accelerated French immersion program to catch up to the kids that had been in French immersion since kindergarten, and I started in grade 3. And it was intense and hard and a little overwhelming. And then I moved into a new class, and I arrived 2 months into the school year. So it was a little intimidating and lonely. And my friend, I made a friend named Stephanie Knack, and she and I were best friends in grade 3, and her dad happened to be a cabinet minister in the Peter Lougheed government. And I remember going over to Stephanie's house and meeting her dad, and it seemed like, wow, he's a cabinet minister. That's a very important person. And I went home and told this to my dad, and he said, you just remember that a politician is a person just like any other person. And it really stuck with me and kind of made me realize that, even now that I'm in politics, that I'm just a person like any other person, and that there isn't this big gap between elected people and non-elected people. And that really kind of hit home with my friend Stephanie and her dad.
So our first 5 years in Uganda, we lived on a very small island in the middle of a lake, and we had no running water, no electricity. And we were running a community development project. So we were working with the community to build up a tourism project, to help them with the farming methods, supporting kids going to school. It was quite a comprehensive community development program. So we were there for 5 years. My daughter was born during that time. So I had a newborn baby on the island for 2 years, which was challenging. If you can imagine hand washing cloth diapers, that kind of says it all. So that was our first 5-year stint. And then we came back to Canada for 5 years. My son was born during that time. And then we went back to Uganda for another 6 years. So my kids were 4 and 6 when we went back to Uganda. 4 and 6, 5 and 7, I can't remember, something like that. For those 6 years, we were living in the third largest city in Uganda. We had electricity and running water most of the time. I was homeschooling my kids, and my husband at the time was leading all of the projects for our organization, and they were mostly centered around gravity-feed water systems. At the same time, I started a fair trade business to support craftspeople in the area. So I was purchasing crafts from local craftspeople and selling them for them to tourists and other people. I had a tiny little shop in my home and was able to support, probably a couple hundred craftspeople in the area through this small business. I did a lot of, when I first had my kids, I was very much opposed to the idea of homeschooling. It just seemed like a impossible task. And then I started to do a lot of research and reading about it and talking to people who homeschooled and really had a 180-degree switch and realized that education at home provides a lot of opportunities for children. And I loved homeschooling. It was just a joy to be with my kids, teaching them and watching them learn things and being a part of that process. So, I mean, homeschooling in Canada is very different than homeschooling in Uganda. Here in Canada, there's just so many resources and opportunities for families. And of course, over there, it was very different. There were no libraries to go to, no events or activities that children could engage in. So it was certainly more challenging. A lot of our luggage when we'd go back to Uganda was books, so that I had lots of resources to teach the children. But we were also in a community with a lot of other people from all over the world. And we would get together and the children have opportunities to play and to get to know other kids and other communities, other cultures. So it was challenging, but it was also a real blessing to have that time with my kids. And, as a result of not just the homeschooling, but growing up in a developing country, they really became people with a different perspective. When we came back to Canada, I realized just how different my kids were, that they had grown up seeing poverty. They'd grown up seeing really horrifying needs in the community and had a different perspective on life and the ability to see the privilege that we have here in Canada. And I think it's made them both a lot more empathetic and just aware of how the other half live.
As a child, I'm not sure what my influences would have been as a child, right? I can't really remember that period, but around 11 is when I started to kind of form a feeling of who I was in the world and the kinds of things that affected me. I actually think that 11 is a key age for girls to kind of place themselves in the world in different ways. So I learned, I guess, how to act in a group, how to work with the difficult. By then at 11, you're starting to see the different kinds of tribes emerging in your high school or in your school, right? You're starting to see the popular kids, the sportsy kids, the smart kids, the artsy kids, the outsiders, all of that different nature. And I could see that I sort of associated more with what I'd call the outsiders. But there was a group of us, so we weren't really too outside because we were inside the outsiders. But that was just a group. I didn't feel like I fit in a lot of the other groups, but I found my fit there with a few friends. And so one of the things that really influenced me in that group, and that still carries through to that day, is that I saw that you shouldn't judge anybody by how they present, right? Like that, or their money, or their clothes, their whatever it is that they have as a kid at that age, does not make them better, worse, dangerous, more intelligent, less intelligent. In other words, you have to get to know people before you ever understand who they are. I think I really learned that at that age. And one of the events that was really significant for me was when I was 14 and in grade 9. And in those days in BC schools, you would be kicked out. If a girl got pregnant, she would be kicked out of school. That was how the education system responded to teenage pregnancy at that time. It's just ridiculous thinking back on it. But I didn't actually know this girl at the time, but she'd gotten pregnant at 13, and she'd had to be, hidden away. She got thrown out of school. She had to be hidden away, and then she gave her baby up for adoption. And she came back, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks after her baby had been born. She came back to school, and I heard one of the popular girls say, "Who's ever going to be friends with her now that she's had a baby?" And I feel like that was sort of an awakening to social justice for me when I heard that, because I thought, well, that's wrong, and became friends with her and have remained friends with her for the rest of my life. Admittedly, I became friends with her as a way of showing this other girl that, yes, indeed, that young woman can have friends, whether she's had a baby or not, and it's not a shameful thing that happened to her. And she was only one. She was just a little girl, really. She was a little girl. And so that's, the kind of standing up for somebody who is being mistreated, judged. I don't know. That to me is a theme that runs through my life. And I trace it back to that time when I was 14.
So this is a really important story from my childhood. I was so fortunate to be part of a pilot project in Edmonton for an early childhood education center that was funded by the city of Edmonton and the province. And at the time, 1975, this was a really big experimental development. And I'd been going to another daycare center that really wasn't very good. It was pretty boring, and they made us lie down on mats all the time, and there wasn't a lot to kind of inspire or intrigue us. And then I went to this early childhood education center, and it was incredible. We got hot lunches every day. There was this range of activities. I learned how to read and write at 5 years old, and I fell in love with learning this 1 year, and it set me on a path to be a successful student for my whole education career, because I, at age 5, learned how to learn. I learned how to love learning. And I look back at that year and think that set me on course for my whole life. And it really hit home for me, in the role that I'm in, how important high quality early childhood education is, and how it is so fundamental to a child's successful educational career. And I still think of that as one of the most wonderful years of my childhood.
In terms of early childhood education, again, I grew up in an era when there was no, that it wasn't really thought about in the same way. But my mother was very keen on having me have a lot of experiences and develop myself. She was very big on developing myself overall. So she put me in, there'd be things like ballet lessons. I did that for a while. I was terrible at ballet. That was a nightmare. But but when I was 10, I was put into classical piano lessons. And for whatever reason, I turned out to be pretty good at piano. And that, I feel like the discipline that I learned there, I had in those days, your piano teacher tended to be very strict and a bit of a disciplinarian, usually themselves. So between my mother and my piano teacher, I was told, you're going to practice this half an hour a day in the early days, right? And you're going to achieve. We're going to help you achieve. And I don't know that I always wanted to, especially when I got to be a teenager, but I did because I was perhaps I was that kind of kid. I don't know. But I did achieve. I did move all the way through my piano years and ended up as a piano teacher. Actually, that was my first job after I got a Associate of the Royal Conservatory of Toronto certificate. And now, when looking back, you don't realize it at the time that this is much more than piano lessons. I feel like my ability, my self-discipline, my ability to organize, and my understanding that I can achieve anything if I apply myself, those were like again, fundamental lessons that I was learning that have stood me well in so many ways through my life, my work life in particular, but also, relationships and other interests and activities. It's just been something to know that you can put your mind to something that seems very difficult and in the moment impossible, learning a big classical piece, for instance, and you can break it down into components and you can work those components, and your mind and your body will respond. Your fingers will learn, your brain will adapt, you will learn something that will stay with you in many ways, that isn't just one classical piece that you now have in your repertoire. It's a much bigger lesson that you have. And I feel like that is where early childhood education can be really important, to help children see the possibilities that are out there, but also to understand from an early age that, you're not good at everything the moment that you touch it, right? That everybody who is good at something learned it and practiced it and developed their thing that they're good at. And I think that is a lesson that is so important for people to learn when they're young.
So I studied history in university, and I got my bachelor's degree in history and then a master's degree in history. And I then started in the education program. It was a really tough year, and I ended up leaving the program before the end of the first year. I lost my father and my stepmother in the 8 months that I was in that program, and really just pulled out, gave myself time to grieve. But ended up going back into the education program and finishing the degree. And it was really important to me to have a career, to have a job that was giving back to the community, and where I could really embody the values that I have of community service, of a recognition of, how do we contribute to a healthy society. And one of the best experiences I had was actually going to a session at UVic given by Mark Neufeld about his creation of this program. At the time, it was a global studies program, and I was so inspired by what he was doing that it became a real model for the kind of teacher that I wanted to be.
So as mentioned, Courtney and me were kind of a exploratory pairing in my teen years, and among those things that I was exploring was early sexual activity. So I got pregnant when I was 16, and again, in those days, a different kind of setup. The man, the boyfriend, virtually you always would get married. In Courtney, in those years, you would get married. So I got married. I think it was a week after my 17th birthday, and we had our son in June of that year. And we stayed married for 8 years. We had 2 children together. We had a pretty good life, especially compared to now when I look at how life is for young people, much harder. But we were able to, he worked in the mill in Campbell River, and so made quite good money. So we were able to buy a house. We had 2 cars. We holidayed in California. We had a comfortable life for 2 kids who didn't know what they were doing. But as you can imagine, getting married at that age and starting to have children so young is not really a great recipe for a solid marriage. And we split up when I was 24. And at that point, I realized that I needed a full-time job. I was a piano teacher who, you just couldn't expand your business suddenly to get full-time work. So I moved away for a year or 2, well, actually more than that, to get trained in what would eventually be my journalism career. And then I remarried and had a 3rd child, a daughter. So I've got a son and 2 daughters. And in later life, I found what I would say is my full life commitment with a man who had 2 children as well. So we have 5 collective children together, all of them adults, and 9 grandchildren.
I married a man who was also strong in his faith, and we went on to be missionaries in Uganda, and we spent 11 years there, and that was a time of a lot of growth, a lot of challenges, and a lot of learning about not learning. It was a time of living under the thumb. Missionaries are really put on pedestals with the expectation of perfection, of being selfless, of serving, of having exemplary morals and behaviors. And I think especially women in those situations have a lot of expectations placed on them. They need to be the perfect wife. They need to be the perfect mother. They need to be completely selfless in their service. They need to be the perfect host. So it was a lot of living with expectations, and often feeling like those expectations were crushing.
The stigma of being a teenage mother in Courtney, in the years that I was that was happening to me, there was no stigma because it was the very common thing. And when I had my son, when I went to hospital and gave birth to him, all the people in my room, there was a 4-bed room, and we were all 17 years old and all friends, in fact. So there was no stigma at that time to being a teenage mom in Courtney. But there was a lot of, it was a hard life, just like it is for any mother, right? There was the balancing of things, the weight of the care of the children always does fall disproportionately on the mother, and the way your kids are turning out, if there's any bad behavior, that is sort of attached to the mother. I think that's still very true, even though we talk about it as being unfair. It doesn't mean that we've changed that. Where I did find, I don't know if stigma is the right word, but the thing that I've noticed as I grew older was that I hated hearing people talk about teenage pregnancy as some kind of loser thing that was the end of the road for this young woman, right? Like, that really struck me as offensive, that we could talk about it as a bad thing, quite frankly, that teenage pregnancy was a bad thing. Now, I'm the first to say it is not easy to have a child at 17, so I'm not endorsing that everybody go out there and, get pregnant when you're a child yourself. But when you think about the resourcefulness and the resilience of a teenage mother, and that the hurdles that she faces, the things that actually impact her economically, are choices that society has made for her, not her fault, if you will. Like a teenage mother will run stats showing how teenage mothers end up in lower economic brackets, have less schooling, all these kinds of things. Well, yes. So why do they end up in lower economic brackets and having less schooling? Because the systems aren't open there to help them. If a young mother wants to continue her education at university or college, can she find the childcare for that? Can she find the support for being able to raise a child and take on a heavy academic load? Is her work understanding of her status as a young mother as she tries to raise her children? To me, that was always the thing, that the teenage mother thing gets pinned onto the teenage mother as it's your fault and you shouldn't have done that, when really our bodies are actually programmed to have children when we're young, right? Like, that's a biological reality. There's no shame in that. The shame is that we still don't have systems that welcome mothers with all the supports that they need to do well.
I think one of the challenges that still exists when it comes to achieving more diversity in politics. And that's not just women, that's people of color, that's people of LGBTQ or non-binary, it's different age people. We need our political realms really to look like the rest of society. We need it to reflect that. When you walk down the hallway in the legislature, there's a wall of all of the photos of premiers of British Columbia. And there are only 2 photos in there that are women. And so the image that people have in their heads of political leaders is an image of an older white man. And it's the challenge that we have is not just getting women elected and having women in leadership positions. It is the notion of what leadership is and what the embodiment of leadership is. And what I found is women in leadership positions often bring a very different way of being and working. And there's a great example of that. You came on a day that's kind of exciting. So the interim leader of the BC Liberal Party for a year was Shirley Bond, while they elected a new leader. Their new leader is Kevin Falcon, but Shirley is still the leader in the legislature right now. And since May of last year, Shirley and I have been advocating for an all-party committee to look at the toxic drug poisoning crisis that we have in BC right now. 7 people die every day. And we have been making the case to the Premier and to the government that we need all-party collaboration and cooperation on this, because that is what is going to get us to a place where we can get to the policies that will save people's lives more quickly. You build that political consensus and then you can go. So we have been asking letters and questions in question period and making the call. And today, because of the coroner's report that just came out on the 6,000 people who have died since this emergency was declared, question period was all about this report and what government can do. And it included this repeated call that Shirley and I have been making since May to have an all-party committee. And on the very last question, not asked by Shirley or me, asked by Mike DeYoung and the Liberal opposition side, will the Premier commit to activating this committee? He finally said yes. So that's an example of an approach to leadership. It was collaborative on our part, on Shirley's and my part. We were asking for more collaboration. We were asking for that kind of approach that gets everybody to the table. And I think that is one of the things that women typically bring to politics and leadership roles, but that it's not how things are typically done. We don't have a particularly collaborative or cooperative culture in these legislatures and parliaments, but we see when we do our best work. And that's going to continue to be a priority for me.
In my journalism career, I was a reporter and for a number of years, and then I got the chance to go into management in newspapers. And at that time, it was the mid-1990s, and there'd been lots of conversations about women in leadership. There was a real desire in the corporate world to have women in leadership positions because it was just like a movement. Everybody wanted women in leadership positions, including the corporation that I worked for. And so I was the glass ceiling, if you will. I guess it doesn't really part, does it? But it opened up and I was able to go into management. But what I quickly saw in a corporation was that the corporation is based on a kind of male view of the world around, and maybe that's unfair. I'm sure there's many men who don't have that view of the world, but a view of the world, let's just say, in which the individuals are seeking money and power, and the goal is to make a lot of money, right? Like that's basically your role in the company, the role of the company, and certainly the role of all the managers is to help the company make money, and in exchange they will have a powerful status, and they will make more money as well. I don't know if I knew it at the time, but again, over the years, thinking back to those years, I only lasted less than 5 years in management and only 1 year in a higher management position, and it was because I didn't have those values, and I couldn't. The way that I could interact with the people there was totally unsatisfying to me in my work and kind of dangerous. It felt like I was living in a dangerous place. I felt like I was in a shark-infested tank, quite frankly, and that I couldn't be honest. I couldn't say, I'm having trouble with this area over here. Could anybody help me? You couldn't ask for help. It was a sign of weakness. And it just felt like this unfamiliar world that I was really sorry I'd ever gotten myself into and needed to get out of for my own good as quickly as I could. And so that's the corporate world. And I'm sure again, I don't want to generalize. I'm sure there's corporations who are ethical and have a different perspective, but the corporate model still drives basically everything about our world, and certainly our economy and the way we think about progress. The way we measure progress is through gross domestic product and other things that are actually coming out of that economic perspective and the economic perspective only. I really feel like if we are the kinds of changes that we want to see, that doesn't happen when the only perspective is the corporate perspective. That comes out of humanitarian perspectives. It comes out of the work of the nonprofit sector, for instance, where I work now, where the nonprofit sector was based on a culture of sharing, doing better, seeing problems in our community that we collectively want to do something about and change. And not coincidentally, the nonprofit sector is full of women leaders, because women find their values reflected in the values of the nonprofit sector. But also, not surprisingly, all those kinds of movements lack money, they lack resources, they're always struggling, and they're climbing up a little hill only to roll back down a much steeper hill and then have to climb up the next one and then roll back down. So somehow we need to find the balance in the way we engage as a society, to understand that absolutely we need corporate, or perhaps we need corporate thinking to advance economic issues and concerns, but at the same time we need to really flesh out this humanitarian social response so that we're bringing in that balance. If it's all about money, we see a rise, as we have, incredible rise in social problems, right? We see it all over, this city of Victoria is full of social problems that have only increased in my years of living here, increased every year. So those problems don't get solved through economic perspectives. They get solved through a social plan and thinking about the needs of our communities in a different way. I'm waiting. I'm hoping that starts to shift. It hasn't shifted in my time, though. I've been looking at these issues as a writer for decades, and it's surprising how little there's been actual movement. There's always examples, somebody can always say, well, what about this? Absolutely. What about this or that? There have been examples of things that have been very good and have changed, perspectives a little bit. But overall, we are not even close to addressing the kind of issues that we need to address to have a Canada that is, yes, paying attention economically, but also really, really supporting social care and social services and social health.
So the permit was issued in 2013. It was appealed at the Environmental Appeal Board. The community lost that appeal, and trucks with contaminated soil started to come into Shawnigan Lake. There were protests. People would stand in front of those trucks. It was also taken to the BC Supreme Court, a judicial review of the Environmental Appeal Board decision, and the Cowichan Valley Regional District took it to the Supreme Court on a zoning file. So there was a lot of different efforts and avenues, everything from, letter writing to up in the courts to blocking the trucks. A lot was uncovered in particular this profit sharing deal, and the Supreme Court did hear the judicial review and ultimately sent the case back to the Environmental Appeal Board. But by then it had become clear that there were a lot of problems with the operation of the site, and the minister at the time, Mary Polak, revoked the permit in February of 2017. So it took really 4 years, beginning to end, of a relentless community effort. We had, we'd worked in every way that we can. There was one day, it was a helicopter day. It was January of 2016. We had politicians and the media. RAFI came, and we flew people in a helicopter over the site all day long so they could see, where this was located uphill from the drinking water. W5 did an episode on it. The amount of media that we generated, we just never gave up on the outcome that we wanted, which is the permit is revoked. And we never gave up on it being about a strong, caring community, and that was really important. Unfortunately, about 100,000 tons of soil was deposited, and this government, the NDP government, allowed the company to do a, quote, closure plan, which we are still concerned about. There continues to be ongoing issues, but at the very least, we prevented this from becoming, a really major disaster for our watershed. And again, to me, it's how do we prevent this from happening in another community? How do we make sure that these decision-making processes are done well, that they're informed by evidence and facts, and that they don't put communities at risk the way that we felt that our community was at risk?
I began my career in journalism when I was in my mid-20s, and that was in the early 1980s. And in those years, just to place the context of Canada, there was no term called sexual harassment in law, and there was no, up until 1984, a man could rape his wife legally because he was considered to have sexual rights regardless of her consent. So it's always important for me to place the 1980s of Canada in that context and what was happening for me as a young person in the workplace. And it had happened in my high school too. So it was like the whole Me Too movement to me and to, I'm sure, so many women of my generation. It's not surprising, we're all Me Too's because we all were experiencing the creepy high school teacher who tried to, trap you in the corner so he could grab at you, the creepy uncle, the creepy guy on your street. Like there was all of us had those experiences. And so when I was a young woman in starting out in journalism, I had bosses who were, I guess what you'd call, in those days, we'd probably use words like touchy or creepy or a bit of a pervert. We didn't use the term sexual harassment because it didn't exist. And we didn't actually think that we had the right to stop it. You could avoid it, and you'd work very hard to avoid it, but you couldn't do anything about it. There was no follow-up, so all you really could do was avoid it, and if it got too bad, quit your job and go find somebody to work for who was not so creepy. So, it's come a long way. It's here in law. We all understand it much more. We're much more aware, but I still think that a lot of women have to deal with it just the same way I did. I think they still don't know how to bring it forward. It's a very different, it's a hard thing to explain. Like when you're being sexually harassed, being groped is a nice clear example. great. You know that you've just been sexually harassed when you've been groped. But there's a way of being spoken to. There's all these things that feel that you in yourself recognize you're being sexually harassed in that moment. You're being treated as an object by this person who is coming in too close or, saying things in a creepy way. But you can't move forward with a complaint about, he said things in a creepy way, it's still a very difficult thing to stop for the person who's actually experiencing it. And it interplays with how you feel about yourself too. There's a lot of, still, right, talk of, well, if your skirt wasn't so short, if your top covered up more, if you didn't wear makeup, if you weren't looking so appealing, right? Again, the blame, it's still there. We still hear it. Whereas men in the workplace or out in public, we never look at the way men present and think that it means that they're opening themselves to sexual predation. But for women still very much, if you dress a certain way, act a certain way, have a certain kind of life, you're seen as, asking for it. That was definitely the case when I was a young woman. I don't think that much has really changed, unfortunately.
I struggled a lot with my mental health, with burnout. My marriage was failing. Early on, it started to fall apart. And all the while, I'm homeschooling my kids. I'm running a small business to support women, and just trying to live this facade of perfection. So that was extremely difficult. And when I was in my early 40s, it all fell apart. My marriage exploded into a million pieces, and I packed up my kids and I came back to Canada. I left my husband and moved into a time of rebuilding, and that was extremely difficult. It was choosing to step outside of all of those expectations and becoming someone that I never thought I would be. It was giving up the dream of the perfect marriage and the perfect family, and making choices that were more about my own well-being and my own health than I'd ever done before.
I was in journalism from 1982 to 2004. And that's a long time to be in any career. I did all kinds of jobs. I really sampled everything that was to be sampled in journalism, and in fact had 7 years as a columnist, which is just like the most wonderful job you can imagine, because you get to write about whatever you want, and it was really interesting. But what started to happen to me in the last probably 10 years of my journalism was I became more and more of a social activist and wanting to see changes on social fronts. And I started to see that journalism, all you could ever be was an observer. All you could ever do was bark, if you will, and hope that somebody else saw you barking and decided to make changes, You couldn't actually make the changes yourself. And in fact, you weren't even supposed to, because journalists are supposed to be objective. So I started growing more and more frustrated with that I was not part of the change. I was just observing where the changes weren't happening and not able to do anything. And that led me to, I had kind of a moment. I suppose we all have moments, but I went to a speaker who had himself, it was Stephen Lewis, and he had himself done some incredible stuff around HIV and AIDS in Africa. But he, in presenting on his path, he pointed out to the audience and said, so what are you doing to change things in the world? And was it the age I was at? Was it that I'd had all these years of reflecting? I don't know. But suddenly I thought, what am I doing? And that question resonated, and I began to realize I needed to leave journalism and become more directly involved in social activism and moving the ball forward on social care. So I jumped into the nonprofit world in 2004. I made a big jump into an organization called Peers Victoria, which is an organization started by and for sex workers here in Victoria. It was like a rocket ride of a learning curve. It was 3 intense years of learning. But when I came out of that, and through that period, I really understood that I could make a difference by using my voice, my journalism skills, the things that I'd learned about the world, the fact that I'd been a teenage mother and had that understanding, like basically all the experiences of my life I saw would inform, including my corporate years, would inform how I could move into social advocacy more. And I've stayed in the nonprofit sector since then. So in 2011, after doing all kinds of jobs in nonprofit and again, like just getting my feet underneath me in terms of good social advocacy and moving issues forward, my partner and I were contemplating, a lap of America or some sort of adventure, right? We felt like we needed an adventure. And we sort of casually muttered about, well, what about international volunteering? Would that be something? And we both thought of an organization that we'd known for many years called CUSO International. I looked it up. I saw that they had these postings. Thought, well, it'll probably take a couple of years to get a posting, so I'll put our names in. And boof, within 2 months, we had confirmed that we would be going to Honduras to work with a nonprofit organization in Honduras in communications. So both of us my partner and I are both in communications. And so we, again, a wild jump, we gave up everything that we had, like all our household things, and moved away to Honduras, Copan Ruinas, Honduras, where we expected to be there for a year. We ended up actually working in Honduras and then Nicaragua for almost 5 years with CUSO International, doing the same kind of work that we'd always done with nonprofits here, from helping them have a website or helping them tell the story of their work, taking photographs, doing that kind of work, but in Spanish, which was another giant learning curve that we went through when we moved down there, and in a completely different culture. And that period of time, it was a wonderful experience that I would recommend to anyone, to be sort of a late life professional who just throws it all in and jumps into something wildly new. It was very difficult, but at the same time, the most rewarding thing was to see that basically when we moved there, I was stripped of all my professional status, right? They didn't know who I was. They didn't care what my resume said. They didn't, I used to be somebody. Like, none of that mattered. I was basically like an 18-year-old fresh out of high school trying to land their first job, right? Like I was back to that level of having to prove myself in my 50s. And, it's pretty shocking to go, holy moly, I gotta reprove myself in my 50s now? But wow, it was so energizing to be able to follow that path and to be able to take on projects and work that I never would have had a chance to do here, but was able to do while we were in Central America. That has been a really positive experience to draw on. And again, I find that all the experiences of your life feed into the experience of the now. And the work that I do now is very much informed by that time in Central America. It also really gave us a different view of Canada. Like, you can tend to think, oh, poor Nicaragua, poor Honduras, they hardly have any money, and Canada's, so wise, so much better. But when you were down there living in this new culture, you could really see the flaws in Canada from back there. They're a very family-oriented culture in Central America. They have all the things that I was talking about, supporting a young mother. They have extended family supports that address the kinds of issues that up here we're sort of isolated and on our own for. And I really saw a warmth and a different way of looking at work in Central America that, again, I really appreciated the insights that Canada's a pretty great country, but there are other ways to live.
I feel really blessed and honored to live not just in Victoria, but in Canada, and to recognize the great privilege of living in a country like this and living in a place like this where we have healthcare, where we have public transportation, where there are community services for people who need extra support. Having lived in a place where there were none of those things, it still strikes me. I can turn on the water and have hot water for a shower, which was not straightforward, in Uganda. I can go to the grocery store and buy whatever I want. And it's just a whole different way of living. And I'm grateful for that. Coming back from Uganda, there was also times where the reverse culture shock was very strong, and where there was a sense of anger that people here have it so good and people over there are living in poverty. And there was a lot of struggle around that internally of how to justify my privileged existence here, knowing that there are so many people in the world who don't even have the basics of life.
The best part of living on Vancouver Island, I think, of course, is the beautiful outdoors. We have everything. We have ocean, we have rivers and lakes and mountains and beautiful agricultural areas, and there's just such an abundance of extraordinary places, and they're at risk. Climate change, loss of biodiversity, industrial activities on the landscape, logging, clear cutting, mining, all of these are hard on the natural world. And I think that in British Columbia we really celebrate the beauty and the bounty and the abundance of the natural world, but we have a long ways to go to properly take care of it and protect it. And one of the things that gives me hope is Indigenous-led conservation projects that restore the natural ecosystems to a place where they are healthy and vibrant. And I think we have to really look at that as a very key and important response to climate change.
So when my kids and I came back to Canada, we had a year of trying to adjust and figure out life again and find a place to live. And I was trying to find work, and it was extremely, extremely stressful and difficult. And then after about a year, I applied here at the Cridge Centre to be the manager of communication and fund development. And I wasn't qualified for the job. I had no qualifications, letters after my name to qualify for this position. But the CEO at the time saw the potential in me. She saw the passion, the heart, and she hired me. And so I started working here in 2014, and it was a steep learning curve that first year. Lots of learning, lots of figuring things out. And I've been here now 7.5 years, and I consider it a real privilege to work here and to be part of an organization that is so active and so relevant in our community. We serve over 2,000 people a year. We have 8 distinct programs, from children and childcare right up to seniors. And we're working in the community in a way that we're looking for the gaps, for the people who are not being served, who are struggling, and working to find ways to support them and to give them opportunities and help them find the resources that they need. So, for example, we have a young parent outreach program. We know that youth who age out of our foster care system are considered very high risk for homelessness, for addiction, for mental health issues, and there are very few supports in place for these young people. So we work with them, specifically a lot with young moms, young women who have become pregnant and are parenting, to make sure that they don't become that statistic. So providing them with ongoing, really basic, relevant support in whatever area they need. So maybe they need a ride to the food bank, or maybe they need someone to be with their children while they go to a doctor's appointment. Or maybe they just need someone to talk to figure out how to parent this 2-year-old. And that's what our Young Parent Outreach Program does. They're just very, they're there when our young parents need support. And that's making a difference in our community. That's keeping more kids out of the foster care system. It's supporting young people so that they don't become a statistic of homelessness or living on the streets. And that's making an impact in our community. And I just think it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And it's an essential thing. And if I can do anything to support that, I'm all in.
I've been with an organization called the Board Voice Society of BC for 4 years now. It's a part-time job. I wasn't sure what kind of work I was going to be doing. It's primarily a communications job, though, and I know that communications job for nonprofit sector. So those two things come together in my mind very easily. And what I've really loved about this work, so basically my work there is to bring the issues of the nonprofit social services sector in BC to government, to help them connect with each other, and to kind of advance support for social services. So all the things that I've been talking about that I was learning as I grew up and grew old, in the various kinds of life experiences and work experiences that I was having, all of them have come together in the work that I do for Board Voice. And it has really let me use, again, my journalism skills for advocacy for social care and social services. So that it's basically, I feel like the job is hitting my professional and personal passions together. And it's been, it's let me get to know government, the provincial government, in a very different way. I had, as a journalist, you see government and you're kind of observing and watching them. As when I was in my Piers Victoria time, I was seeing them as funders. And now what I'm seeing, I'm learning so much around the strategy of trying to change government's minds, where it needs to be changed. What is the effective way to come into government and expect something to change, rather than just, either railing against government because they're not doing what you want, or hoping that you can cozy up to them and you will get what you want. Instead, finding this other path where you can bring forward the arguments that will convince. I really love the chance to convince, because bashing someone over the head doesn't really work. It has to be about convincing to see change. And I hope that what I'm doing with Board Voice is ever so, in a small way, creating the kind of change that will lead to as we've talked about more attention to social needs and social care.
Particularly as a member of a two-person opposition caucus, we of course want to focus on solutions and things that can be done to address really pressing problems and issues, but we have to come to terms with the fact that we have a very limited role that we are able to play on that front. But it's what keeps me going and kind of gives me the strength even when things get very hard and tiring and disappointing is this idea that there's always that possibility for a better world, for people to be well and healthy, and for us to make the decisions that protect our environment and protect the future. And I think that it's that idea that we can always be finding a way to contribute to a better future, even when it feels really frustrating and really hard some days.
So the Courage Center for the Family will be celebrating our 149th birthday this year. We're the oldest running nonprofit in Western Canada, and we started off as an orphanage. So we have been providing care and support to children since the beginning, and we still do that now. We have a child care program that serves around 200 children every week. Children coming from all walks of life, and then of course we've broadened from just being a childcare organization. As I mentioned, we have 8 distinct programs. So childcare, we have senior services, so we serve around 80 seniors who live here on site and are with us either with assisted living or independent living. We have a program that supports families who have children with a disability or mental health diagnosis. That's called Respite and Respitality. It's really providing support to the caregivers, to the parents, so that they can take a break and find relaxation and refreshment in the community, so that they can continue to serve their children and to take care of their children. We have the Young Parent Outreach Program, which I already talked about. We have a transition house for women who are leaving an abusive relationship. That's an emergency shelter, so up to 30 days is what's supposed to be the norm for women to stay there as they start to rebuild their lives. Once they then they move on to what we call second stage housing, which we provide here and in the community, opportunities for those same women and their children to live in a supportive housing situation where they're living independently but still receiving supports and services from our staff. In that housing, we also have a number of refugee and immigrant families who have come to us, receiving the same types of supports. And those supports are really about rebuilding their lives, about moving on from trauma and lack of safety to a place of stability, safety, community engagement. We also have a brain injury program that supports survivors of brain injury. That's a residential home as well as community supports. What am I missing? The last program that I haven't mentioned is our newest program, and that's providing supports to women who have received a brain injury as a result of intimate partner violence. And this is really a new area, not just for us, but new around the world, as people have finally put those two pieces together and recognized that women who have been abused most of the time have received at least one brain injury, and that brain injury has a dramatic impact on their life and the choices that they make and how they heal and move forward. So that's a really urgent need that we see in our community. And we're working in a variety of ways to not just support women, but also to advocate for them, to change policy, to get funding to support them, and also to train first responders and police and lawyers and doctors and nurses, so that when a woman presents saying, my partner has beaten me, they know to ask the questions about brain injury, so that that woman can be diagnosed and supported for her brain injury, and not just for her broken arm or the bruises or whatever. So 8 programs, a wide reach in our community, lots of partnerships in our community with other organizations, and lots of people receiving services in a variety of different ways.
I think that my life has personally been an example of how you can have various life experiences happening to you, not all of them necessarily welcome at the time, and yet discover that all of that is feeding you, is sustaining you, and is preparing you to make your own kind of change in the world that you want to achieve. When I think about women who might feel like they're too weak or powerless to make change, who's going to listen to little old me, all that kind of thing, all I would say is just try to let that go. I don't know, try to let that go and think about the richness of your experiences. Whatever job you're doing, whatever position you're in, you have learned so much that is applicable to everything else. When I was in management, the thing that I called on in management was the fact that I had been a mother, and I understood the principles of motherhood, which totally apply to management. So I think to recognize that the experiences that we're all having are teaching us how we can be part of this, cycle of change, how we can move issues forward. And where things seem big, be like me with the piano lessons. Go find that 8-bar section and practice that section over and over again, and you'll see, and win that bit. And then that bit leads to another bit, to another bit. Don't think big right off the hop. Think big in your dreams, I guess, and then think small in your plans.
This is important, that find that thing, find the issue or the thing that you want to make a difference, that you want to be a champion for. Imagine what it is to succeed. Imagine what it means to be successful in that work. And then just relentlessly work towards that. And some days it'll feel like there's no point or it's too hard, but then get up the next day and try again, because what else can we do in the world that we're in right now? There's so much that needs our care and attention and our passion, and we need people who are willing to commit themselves to doing what we can to try to make things better. And it can be really hard and really discouraging sometimes, but it is the most purposeful work I've ever done.
We all face challenges. We all have moments in our life that seem overwhelming, where our circumstances are more than what we think we can handle. And I think as women, we have these expectations of ourselves and that our society places on us of how we need to be perfect and live in service to others. And those are big expectations. Those are weights that we carry that are not always healthy. And so I think when we all are in those places of overwhelm, of burnout, of feeling like life is too much, there's always hope. There's always someone who we can reach out to for a helping hand. There's always a resource in the community that can help us out with whatever the need is. I think there's always hope, and sometimes that hope seems far away, but I believe that that our challenges can be overcome, and that we can find a place of healing and health and stability. But we need other people to help us along the way, and to support us, and to care for us, and just to be there for us. And many of us are fortunate that we have friends and family who provide that role for us, but there are also people who don't, and who are unsupported in our community. And that's where organizations like the Cridge Center come in, where we can provide that support, that care, and help people move on to the next step towards health and happiness.